I want you to understand what I was when I took this job. Not who I was before, who I was at the moment I signed the papers. I had just come through a year that I'm not going to describe in detail, except to say that my mother died in February, and I did not handle it well, and I did not handle it at all, and the people who knew me before February and knew me by September of that year were dealing with two different people, and neither of them was entirely functional. The lookout tower job was not a career move, it was a removal. 5 years ago, I was 31 years old, and I needed to be somewhere that had no people in it, no conversations I needed to manage, no mirrors. The Mount Hood National Forest District posted an opening for a fire lookout at a tower in the Bull Run watershed, and I applied because I wanted to disappear into somewhere legitimate and come back when I was ready. The tower worked. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Something about the altitude and the solitude and the specific quality of work. Watching for fire, which means watching the horizon constantly, which gives the mind a task that uses its full capacity without requiring anything emotional. Something about all of that rebuilt the part of me that had come apart. I have been in that tower every summer for 5 years. It is the place I sleep best. It is, if I'm honest, the closest thing I have to home. I need you to hold that when I tell you what happened in August of my 4th year. I am not a frightened person. I am not an imaginative person in the way that produces hallucinations. I am a person who sits in a glass-walled tower 80 feet above the forest floor and watches for smoke, and I have been doing it long enough to know the difference between what the Cascades contain and what they don't. Or I thought I did. There is a subalpine meadow about a mile north of my tower, a long oval of grass and sedge and low willow that sits in a depression between two pumice ridges, the kind of meadow that forms around a shallow seasonal pond that fills in spring and empties by August. I had been watching that meadow for 4 years from the tower deck. I knew its population. Elk, usually 3 to 7 individuals through July. Ground squirrels in the meadow margin. Clark's nutcrackers working the whitebark pine at the upper edge. A pair of red-tailed hawks that nested on the east ridge and hunted the meadow almost every afternoon. On August 14th, I walked down to that meadow because the afternoon was clear, and I had completed my fire watch log, and I wanted to be in the grass instead of above it for a while. That was the entire plan. An hour in the meadow, back to the tower, before dark. I noticed the quiet before I reached the meadow. Not the quiet of late afternoon when the wind drops and the birds settle. I know that quiet. It has a texture, a soft, inhabited quality. This was different. This came through the lodgepole pine on the approach trail as a kind of pressure, a progressive diminishment of sound, until by the time I reached the meadow margin, I was in a silence that felt less like absence and more like suppression, like something had turned the world down, not off, down. The way a hand over a speaker muffles rather than silences. And the silence that results has the quality of the hand, has something behind it. The meadow was empty. And I mean empty in a way that meadow had never been empty in 4 years of observation. No elk, no ground squirrels, no nutcrackers in the white bark. The red-tailed hawks. I looked at the east ridge where they nested, and the sky above it was clear and unoccupied. Nothing was using that meadow. Everything that normally used that meadow had made a decision, at some point before I arrived, to be somewhere else. I know what predator pressure does to a landscape. A cougar moving through an area will suppress prey activity for hours, sometimes longer. I have seen that before. This felt like more than predator pressure. This felt like evacuation. I sat on a rock at the meadow margin, and I wrote in my field notebook. And I told myself the silence was a coincidence of timing, and that in 20 minutes the elk would drift back in, and the nutcrackers would resume. That is the kind of thing I tell myself because it is usually true. It was not true that afternoon. The smell arrived first, or rather, the absence of smell, which is its own information. The subalpine meadow in August has a specific layered scent. The warm grass, the damp peat at the low center where the pond dries late, the resinous pitch of the white bark pine, the faint sweetness of the yarrow and lupine at the upslope margin. I have sat in that meadow enough times that I carry the smell of it in the way you carry the smell of places that have meaning to you. What I was sitting in had none of that. The air was flat, neutral, the way the air in a room smells when the windows have been sealed for a long time, and everything volatile has already off-gassed into nothing. I wrote that in my notebook. Smell absent. I underlined it. Then I looked up at the far tree line, the lodgepole and mountain hemlock on the north side of the meadow, and I saw the dark. I need to be careful about this word because I am not describing darkness in the way of shadows or the absence of light. The light that afternoon was good. Late summer, 4 o'clock, the sun still well above the west ridge. The tree line across the meadow was lit in the way of a lit tree line, dappled, variable, the way I have looked at it 1,000 times. And within that tree line, at approximately the 11 o'clock position from where I was sitting, there was a section of dark that was not optical. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a deeper gap between trees. It was a density, a quality of not light that existed independently of the light sources around it, that didn't behave the way shadows behave when you shift your angle. I shifted my angle 3 times. The dark stayed where it was. It was roughly vertical, roughly the width of a large tree, maybe wider. And it had, if I am being completely precise, a quality of containment. The dark did not spread, did not fade at its edges the way shadows fade. It had a margin, and the margin was not static. I watched it for 11 minutes by my watch. I wrote in my notebook. I described what I was seeing in the language I use to describe anything in the field, which is precise and flat and as free of interpretation as I can make it. Dense visual anomaly, north tree line, approximately 11 o'clock bearing, vertical orientation, estimated width 4 feet, height unknown due to canopy, not shadow consistent, does not shift with angle change. I wrote that, and then I wrote, I am going to walk toward it, and I did not do that. I didn't decide not to do it. I just didn't do it. My legs had a different opinion than my notebook, and they stayed where they were, and I sat on the rock for another few minutes. And then I stood up and I walked back to the tower. I found the tracks the next morning. The pumice soil on the north trail, the trail that approaches the meadow from the direction of the density I'd observed, is fine and pale and holds impressions with excellent clarity. I found the first impression 40 meters from the meadow margin, and I stopped and I took out my field tape and I measured it before I did anything else, because I knew if I didn't measure it first, I would talk myself out of the measurement later. 24 inches from heel strike to the forward edge of the toe zone. I measured that 3 times. 24 inches. I measured my own boot for reference. 11.5 inches. The impression showed 5 distinct toe contacts. The big toe clearly separated from the lateral 4. Full plantar contact across the arch. the heel depression approximately 3/4 of an inch deep in pumice that was supporting my own weight at less than half that. I followed the trackway. The stride, center of one heel strike to center of the next, was 96 inches, 8 feet between steps. I am 5'7", and my walking stride is 28 inches, 8 feet. The trackway came from the north along the trail and entered the meadow and crossed the meadow and reached the tree line at approximately the 11 o'clock position I had been watching the previous afternoon. The last track in the pumice before the tree line was clear and deep. There were no tracks returning. The tree line at that point is underlaid with volcanic rock shelf, where the pumice gives way to the basalt substrate of the ridge, which does not retain impressions. I photographed every impression. I made a sketch map of the trackway with measurements. I wrote everything in my field notebook, and I stood at the edge of that tree line for about 5 minutes looking into it, at the lodgepole and the hemlock and the specific section of canopy shadow where the density had been, and I felt something I want to describe accurately. My jaw was clenched. I became aware of that, and I consciously unclenched it, and it clenched again on its own. The muscles in my jaw doing something my decision to relax them couldn't override. My stomach was tight in a way that had nothing to do with hunger, and everything to do with the particular knowledge that something very large had stood in the tree line 20 yards from me the previous afternoon, and I had been sitting on a rock with my back partially toward it, and my field notebook open, and my pen moving. And I had felt the density, and I had watched the density, and I had written about the density, and I had not known, sitting there, that what I was observing was a living thing. Or I had known. That's the more honest version. My legs had known. I filed a report with the district office. The response was standard: a note about potential bear activity, a recommendation to carry bear spray on trail surveys. The track measurements were noted in the log as unverified and filed. I didn't argue with that. I don't know what I would have argued for. Here's what I know 4 years later. I know that something stood in the tree line on August 14th and watched me for 11 minutes while I wrote in my field notebook, and that the meadow and everything that lived in it had cleared before it arrived. I know its foot was 24 inches long, and its stride was 96 inches, and it moved through old-growth Cascade forest without producing a sound that I, a person trained to detect anomalies at distance, could identify. I know the dark in the tree line was not a trick of the light. I still work the Mount Hood Tower. I still walk to the meadow. Not every afternoon the way I used to, and not without my field tape in my pocket and my eyes on the north tree line from the moment the meadow comes into view. I sleep well there. I have always slept well there. That hasn't changed. But I leave the north window open now, the one that faces the meadow, and some nights when the air is still, I lie in my bunk and I smell what the meadow smells like, the warm grass and the pine pitch and the yarrow. And I take a small inventory of all of it, every component of the smell, and I note what's present and what's absent. The flat air, the sealed room, that's the signal. I have not smelled it again. I don't know yet whether that's good news or whether it just means I haven't been paying attention at the right moment. I'm going to record this because if I say it out loud into a machine, I'll be less tempted to edit it. That's the theory. I've been wanting to say this for 2 years, and every time I've started to, I've heard how it sounds and I've stopped. So, recording. No editing. My name is Dev Okafor. I was a software engineer for 9 years. I made a lot of money and I was very good at the work, and by the time I was 34, I understood that the work had taken something from me that I was not going to get back if I kept doing it. The marriage ending was connected to that. Not a simple causation, but connected. My ex-wife and I made each other worse over the last 3 years, and we both knew it, and we were both too tired to make the decision until the decision made itself. I took the lookout job because I needed something real. That's the precise word, real. I needed a job where, if I did it wrong, a forest burned down, where the consequence was physical and immediate, and not mediated by a screen. I needed to be in a body in a landscape with weather and altitude and actual darkness. The Willamette District posted an opening. I applied. I got it. I have never once regretted it. What I'm about to describe happened in July of my 3rd year, on a backcountry patrol route I had hiked 17 times. I know that number because I keep a log. 17 times in 3 years, the same 11 miles, the same elevation profile from the tower south to the Tumbling Creek drainage and back. I know every landmark on that route, every burn scar, every rock feature, every section of old growth where the canopy closes and the light changes. I know the route well enough to walk it in reduced visibility. I have walked it in reduced visibility. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what I noticed on July 17th was not the product of unfamiliarity. I wasn't misreading terrain I didn't know. I was in terrain I knew extremely well, and the terrain was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the smell, or the absence of it. The Willamette old growth in July has a specific atmospheric quality that I think about when I'm away from it in winter. The Douglas fir and western red cedar and big leaf maple, all contributing their volatile compounds to an air that smells alive in a way that the word alive doesn't fully convey. You breathe it, and something in your nervous system responds to it, something older than language, something that says, this is the kind of place the body was made for. I have read the research on forest bathing, on phytoncide compounds, and cortisol reduction, and I believe all of it, but I also believe the research is describing something the body already knew. At approximately mile 4 on the southbound route, passing through a section of old growth between 2 ridges where the canopy is fullest and the undergrowth is thick with sword fern and oxalis, the smell stopped, not diminished, not transitioned into a different smell, stopped, like a door closing. One step I was in the air I knew, and the next step I was in air that had no character at all, neutral, flat, the smell of nothing, which, if you have spent time in a healthy old-growth forest, you know is not a thing that exists. There is always something. Even on the coldest, stillest January day, this forest has a smell. The absence of it is as specific as a particular smell. It is its own information. I stopped walking. I took out my field notebook and I wrote, "Smell absent, mile 4, 1340 hours." I checked the wind with my hand. There was a light movement from the southwest, which should have been carrying the forest smell toward me, not away. I noted that. Then I took out my compass. I use the compass on this route out of habit more than necessity. I know the route, but I log bearings at established waypoints as part of my patrol documentation. My waypoint at mile 4 is a bearing of 187 degrees magnetic, southwest toward a prominent basalt outcrop I use as a visual reference. I took the bearing. The compass read 201 degrees. I checked the compass against my usual reading 3 times. I checked for metal objects near the compass. Nothing on my body that would cause deviation. I moved 10 feet east and took the reading again, 201. I moved 15 feet west, 202. I walked a full circle with the compass held level and watched the needle. In a normal environment, the needle tracks north consistently as you turn. The needle on my compass was pulling 14 degrees east of where it should have been, with a slight but definite deviation that intensified as I moved toward the section of forest to the north. I have never seen a field compass deviate 14 degrees without an electromagnetic source. There are no power lines within miles. There are no ore deposits in this section of the Willamette that would produce a magnetic anomaly of this magnitude at the surface. I am not a geologist, but I have a working knowledge of the Cascade geology in this district, and I could not account for what my compass was telling me. I took out my GPS unit. I had a waypoint saved for this exact location from a survey I'd done in the spring. The unit reported my current elevation as 4,247 feet. My saved waypoint reported 4,236 feet. 11 feet of discrepancy at a fixed location between two readings taken with the same device 8 weeks apart. I am a person who logs data. These are the data points. I am not going to speculate about what they mean. I am going to tell you what I observed next. The temperature dropped. Not a gust of cooler air. Not the temperature differential you feel crossing from sun into shade. A drop, sustained, immediate, without any change in the sky above me or the canopy around me. I was wearing a light long-sleeve shirt, and the cold moved through it as if the fabric had become irrelevant, as if the cold was operating at a different register from normal atmospheric cold, reaching the skin through the clothing rather than around it. I checked my thermometer. It had been 64 degrees for the past 2 miles. It now read 51, 13 degrees in under a minute. No cloud cover change, no wind increase. The dark in the windbreak appeared while I was looking at the thermometer. I say windbreak because that's what the grove of big leaf maple and Douglas fir on the west side of the trail functions as. It breaks the prevailing southwest wind, and the result is an area of still air that the temperature differential makes distinct from the surrounding forest. The Windbreak Grove. I have walked past it 17 times. When I looked up from the thermometer, the windbreak had a section of dark in it that I had not previously observed, and that did not correspond to any shadow or light gap pattern I recognized from 17 passes. Compact. Roughly 4 feet wide, 7 or 8 feet tall, bounded at its edges the way shadow is bounded, except that the light source geometry didn't support a shadow of that dimension in that location, and it was facing me. I want to be precise about that phrase, facing me. The dark was oriented. The forward aspect of it was toward me. I can't tell you how I knew that. I can tell you that I knew it the way you know you're being watched from behind before you turn around, which is a real phenomenon with a real neurological basis involving peripheral field sensitivity and micro changes in the ambient sound field. And it manifested physically as a pressure between my shoulder blades and a tightening of the skin across my upper back, and a sudden intense awareness that my collar, the back of my collar, was the most exposed and unprotected surface of my body. My pupils dilated to the point where the afternoon light felt bright in a way it hadn't moments before. A visible brightness increase without any change in actual illumination, which is what dilated pupils produce when they overcompensate for perceived darkness. I could feel the dilation as a slight pressure behind my eyes, a mild ache at the orbital rim. My breathing went shallow without my deciding to make it shallow. My stomach contracted once, hard, the way a stomach contracts in the moment before nausea, and then held, tight, a fist of muscle below my diaphragm. My jaw closed, and my back teeth came together, and the masseter muscles of my jaw were working without my having bitten down on anything. Both hands tightened on the GPS unit I was still holding. I became aware, with the specific clarity that extreme attention produces, of my own heartbeat, not racing, actually slower than resting rate. The body running a different calculation than panic. Something older, something that was making decisions about movement and stillness and whether I was currently visible to whatever was looking at me. The dark held still, and then, at its margin, the shimmer. I have been trying to find the right description for 2 years, the closest I can come. The visual distortion above hot pavement on a summer road, the way the air above asphalt in full sun bends the light, the heat shimmer that produces the illusion of water in the distance. That visual quality, that bending of the background image through a displaced medium, but cold. The shimmer was cold, and it had a boundary. The heat shimmer on pavement fades at its edges. This had a margin, a defined zone of distortion, roughly the same dimensions as the dark within which it appeared. And the background behind it, the ferns and the moss on the tree trunks, and the dappled light coming through the maple canopy, the background was bent, refracted, as if I were looking at it through curved glass. The shimmer moved. 1 degree to the left, 2 degrees, it was turning. Whatever was producing the visual distortion was rotating, and the bending of the background image shifted as it turned, and I understood with the part of my brain that tracks spatial relationships and body orientation that what I was watching was the process of something very large turning to face me more directly. I took 1 step backward, then another. The shimmer didn't move toward me. It held, and I kept stepping backward, 1 step at a time, keeping my eyes on the windbreak grove, and at 50 feet the cold lessened, and at 60 feet the compass needle straightened, and at 80 feet the smell returned. The fir and cedar and wet earth, all of it sudden and full and almost overwhelming after the flat nothing I'd been standing in. And I turned around and I walked the 4 miles back to the tower at a pace that my log records as significantly faster than my normal patrol pace. I filed the compass deviation in my patrol log as a notation under magnetic anomalies, which is a real category in the district log format. The GPS discrepancy I logged as equipment calibration error. The temperature drop I logged as microclimate event, which is a real phenomenon in old-growth forest and a legitimate explanation for a temperature differential, except for the 13-degree magnitude and the 30-second duration, which I did not include in the log because there is no category for them. I went back to that section of trail 8 days later. In the middle of the day, good visibility, bearing spray on my hip. The windbreak grove smelled normal. The compass read correctly. The temperature was consistent with the surrounding forest. I walked through the grove and stood where the dark had been and felt the sword fern against my shins and the dappled maple light on my face. And I stood there for a while, taking in all the normalcy. There were no tracks in the soil. The trail substrate at that location is packed mineral soil over basalt and doesn't retain impressions. I did not expect to find tracks. I was not there to find tracks. I was there to stand in the place in the daylight and make myself understand that the place was just a place. It worked, sort of. The place was just a place. But I carry my compass now more carefully. I check it at mile 4 on every southbound patrol. I log the reading. Every time it reads correctly, 187 degrees, as it should, I write it down and I take a breath and I keep walking. The day it doesn't read correctly, I'm going to know what that means. I'm going to know it before I look at the windbreak. I'm going to know it from the air. That's the thing I live with, not the event. The knowing now, the understanding that the compass is measuring something real and that what it measures has a relationship to this landscape that precedes every human being who has ever held a compass in this forest and will still be here when every compass has rusted to nothing. I have been asked to give this statement to the board, and I want to be clear at the outset that I am doing so because I believe the information is materially relevant to the decision you are making about the trail closure, and not because I expect you to receive it easily. I am 53 years old. I have been a fire lookout in this district for 5 years, and I spent 12 years before that as a habitat biologist for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I know how to observe a landscape, and I know how to describe what I observe. What I am going to describe is what I found on the morning of September 4th at the basalt rim above Obsidian Creek. My daughter left for college in September of my first year in the tower. I took the job partly for the solitude and partly because the house in Bend was too large for one person and the tower is smaller and more honest about what it is. I am not a lonely person. I am a person who has learned to be comfortable alone, which is different. The tower suited me. It still suits me. I am not telling you this to explain anything away. I am giving you the context the board needs to assess the credibility of this account. On September 3rd, I conducted my standard late-season perimeter survey, which in the Deschutes old-growth section of my district means a 6-mile loop through ponderosa pine and lodgepole, dropping to the creek drainage at the 3-mile mark and climbing back via the basalt rim. I have done this survey 22 times. I know every feature of the route. The survey was normal until the creek section. Obsidian Creek at the 3-mile mark runs shallow over obsidian gravel. The black volcanic glass that gives the creek its name and that produces a specific sound, a finer, higher frequency trickle than you get from granite or sandstone gravel. A bright sound, almost crystalline. I have used that sound to gauge my approach to the creek on this route across 22 surveys. In clear weather, in typical conditions, I can hear the creek from approximately a quarter mile. On September 3rd, I did not hear the creek until I was 30 feet from it. The sound dropped off. That is the most accurate description I have. Not that the creek was quieter than usual. The water level was normal for late season, but that the sound of it was being suppressed in the way that sound is suppressed by heavy snowfall, which absorbs acoustic energy across frequency bands. There was no snow. It was 58 degrees and dry. The suppression had no atmospheric cause. The birds along the creek drainage had been absent from the half-mile mark. I noted that at the time, the Steller's jays that work the riparian zone, the dippers that hunt the creek margin, the American goldfinch in the willows at the bank, all absent. Creek drainage habitat is typically the most bird-dense section of this route. I walked half a mile of it with no avian contact at all. I sat at the creek for 20 minutes, eating my lunch, observing and noting the absence. The air at the creek had a heaviness that I want to describe carefully. Not humidity. The relative humidity was low that day. A pressure. A quality of atmospheric density that I felt against my skin and against my face and in my ears, slightly. The way you feel altitude change in your ears, except this was an increase rather than a decrease, an addition to the air rather than a subtraction. I have read accounts of people describing this feeling in proximity to large animals, bison, elephant, and attributing it to low-frequency vocalizations below the threshold of hearing that produce physical pressure in the surrounding air. I am not asserting that is what I was experiencing. I am describing what I experienced in terms that allow comparison. Nothing happened at the creek. I finished lunch. I climbed to the basalt rim. The rim above Obsidian Creek is a geological feature unique to this drainage. A long arc of columnar basalt, about 40 feet high. The columns formed by cooling lava flows during the volcanic activity that shaped this section of the Cascades approximately 7,000 years ago. The rim is hard, dense stone, and it holds up well even under significant load. I have never seen it marked in 5 years of surveying above it. On September 4th, returning to the rim section on my morning patrol, I found the print. I saw it from 15 feet. Even at that distance, the scale of it was apparent, before I had processed any specific detail. The area of contact, the space it occupied on the flat rim surface, was simply larger than any hand impression I had expected to see in that environment or any other. I approached it, and I crouched beside it, and I took out my calipers before I did anything else. Palm width, 11.4 inches. I measured this 3 times at the widest point of the palm impression, each measurement within a millimeter of the others. Finger length. I measured each digit individually. Thumb, 6.8 inches. Index, 7.9. Middle, 8.2. Ring, 8.1. Pinky, 6.4. Average finger length across 4 primary digits, 8.1 inches. These are the measurements of a hand with the proportional relationships of a primate hand. The thumb shorter than the fingers, the middle finger the longest, the tapering to the outer digits, but at a scale that puts it outside the range of any living primate I am aware of. The depth of the impression in the basalt surface, 3 millimeters. I measured this with the depth gauge on my calipers, 3 millimeters in columnar basalt. I have a geology reference in my field pack, and I looked up the compressive strength of basalt while I was standing there. Basalt has a compressive strength of approximately 100 to 300 megapascals. 3 millimeters of surface depression in basalt is not the product of a hand resting on the surface. It is not the product of a hand pressing on the surface. It is the product of a load that exceeds what the stone can absorb without deforming. The impression was not struck. There was no percussion pattern at the edges. It was pressed, slowly, with sustained force. I photographed the impression from 6 angles with scale references. I recorded every measurement in my field notebook. I documented the surrounding rim surface for 40 feet in each direction and found no other marks. I documented the absence of any approach evidence. The rim surface above and below the impression was clean. No scoring from climbing, no tool marks, nothing to indicate how whatever made that impression reached the surface of a 40-foot basalt column. Then I sat back on my heels, and I held my own right hand over the impression, and I looked at the ratio. My hand, spread as wide as it will spread, covers approximately 8 inches across the palm, and my middle finger is 3.5 inches long. I held my hand over the impression the way you hold your hand over a child's hand to show the difference, and the impression was nearly double my handspan, and the finger lengths were more than double my own, and the stone around the impression had simply yielded to what had pressed against it. I want to describe what my body did at this moment as accurately as I can, because I believe it is the more honest account of what I understood before my mind finished constructing its understanding. My skin registered something across my entire back and neck simultaneously, not the specific localized crawl of a single hair rising, but a full surface response, the way skin responds to sudden cold, except the temperature had not changed. My hands were steadier than usual, which surprised me. The steadiness was not composure. It was the particular steadiness of a nervous system that has exceeded the threshold where tremor is produced and entered a state of motor inhibition, the body conserving fine motor function for tasks that might require it. I was completely still. My eyes were moving, but the rest of me had stopped, in the specific way that stillness is produced by decision rather than calm. The ridge was silent. The suppression I had felt at the creek the previous afternoon was present here in a different form. Not a muffling of ambient sound, but an absence of sound generation. Nothing in the surrounding forest was producing sound. I was on the rim for 23 minutes, I timed it, and in 23 minutes I heard nothing except my own breathing and my own heartbeat, which I could hear in my ears with unusual clarity, which happens when ambient sound is fully removed. I climbed down from the rim and I walked back to the tower. I submitted a formal wildlife evidence report to the district office with the photographs and measurements attached. The district biologist logged it as unverified large mammal evidence. I requested that the log include the specific measurements and the basalt deformation depth. I do not know whether it does. I am telling the board this because the trail closure proposal includes the rim section, and I believe the closure is warranted, and I believe it is warranted for reasons beyond the official rationale. The evidence I documented is real, and it is documented, and the measurements are what they are. And whatever pressed its hand into 40-foot basalt 40 feet off the ground has a relationship to this ridge that predates this Forest Service district by a margin I can't calculate. I have one more season in the tower before I retire. I will complete that season. But I do not go to the rim alone anymore. I have not been to the rim alone since September 4th. That is not a decision I made. It is a fact I discovered when I tried to go alone and found that I had already turned around before I reached the approach trail. That's my statement. I did 2 tours, Iraq and then Afghanistan, back to back, with 4 months in between. I'm telling you that at the start, not for sympathy and not as a caveat. I'm telling you because it's the baseline for my claim that I am not easily frightened. I know what frightened feels like in my body. I know the adrenaline signature and the tunnel vision and the specific quality of attention that combat induces, and I know the difference between that response and other fear responses. And I know the difference between those and rational concern, which is what most situations that people call frightening actually are. What happened at the clearing on Mount Jefferson was not rational concern. It was not a combat fear response. It was something I don't have a clean category for, even now, 4 years later, and I'm someone who has spent 4 years thinking about categories. I came to the lookout work after a period of reintegration that my VA counselor describes as extended. I don't disagree with that description. The wilderness helped in a specific way. It gave me large-scale environment without people, which is a combination that my nervous system required. The Cascade Forest at altitude, the Mount Jefferson Wilderness specifically, is a place that makes human problems feel appropriately scaled. I find that comforting. I have never found it frightening. That changed in August of my 4th year. There is a clearing on a trail I patrol, about 3 miles southeast of my tower, where a section of old forest came down in a windstorm several years before my posting. The downed timber has mostly decomposed. The nurse logs colonized by sword fern and Oregon oxalis, and the opening in the canopy has allowed enough light through to support a ground layer of beargrass and sedge that doesn't grow in the closed forest around it. It's maybe an acre, a natural break in the old growth, the light in it different from the closed canopy forest on all sides, the air in it warmer on sunny afternoons. In mid-August, I came to the clearing on my afternoon patrol, and the air was not warmer. That was the first wrong thing. It was 2 in the afternoon, clear sky, and the clearing should have been the warmest point on the trail. The canopy gap allows direct sun for most of the day. I carry a handheld thermometer for fire weather monitoring. I read it before entering the clearing, 71 degrees. I stepped into the clearing and walked to the center and took another reading. The temperature in the clearing was 60 degrees, an 11-degree drop from the surrounding forest in the open sun in mid-August. That is the inverse of every temperature differential this kind of forest clearing produces. The sun was on my back and I was cold. I walked the clearing perimeter with the thermometer, taking readings. The temperature in the surrounding forest was consistently 71 degrees. The temperature within the clearing varied between 58 and 62 degrees, with the coldest readings in a roughly 15-foot diameter zone at the northeast quadrant. I mapped the temperature zones in my notebook. The cold zone was specific, localized, and it was about 4 degrees colder at the center than at the edge, which means the source of the cold, if cold can have a source, was at the center. There was nothing at the center of the cold zone. I walked through it. I walked through it twice. Clear ground, beargrass, the same volcanic soil as the rest of the clearing. No surface feature I could identify as a cause. The wind in the clearing was wrong, too. There was a light southwest wind that day, consistent across the ridge, the kind of steady mountain wind that moves through a canopy gap in a predictable direction. The wind in the clearing was moving northeast, against the prevailing direction. Not a gust, not an eddy, a sustained movement in the wrong direction. The beargrass in the clearing all leaning slightly against the wind that was moving through every other part of the forest. I noted both anomalies and kept moving. I know when something is worth stopping for and when it's worth noting and continuing, and at that point, what I had was temperature data and wind behavior that was unusual but not dangerous, and I had a patrol to finish. I came back to the clearing that evening because I had not been able to stop thinking about it. That is the honest account. I went back alone at 7 in the evening with a headlamp and my thermometer and my notebook because the professional part of my brain wanted more data, and the other part, the part that has been operational since 2 tours in 2 combat zones, wanted to know what was in the northeast quadrant of that clearing. The temperature at 7 in the evening was 56 degrees in the surrounding forest. It was 56 degrees in the clearing, except in the northeast quadrant, which read 67 degrees. The cold zone had become a warm zone, 11 degrees above the ambient temperature, in a section of open forest with no thermal source. Nothing generates localized warmth in a forest clearing at 7 in the evening. Animals do, but an animal producing that much thermal output would be visible. There was nothing visible in the northeast quadrant. Then the shimmer. I have described this to my VA counselor who referred me to a different counselor, and I have described it to one person who believed me, and I am going to describe it here. The shimmer was in the warm zone. It occupied a roughly oval vertical space, approximately 4 feet wide and 8 to 9 feet tall. It was the visual quality of a heat shimmer, the bending of the background image through a displaced medium, the refraction of the beargrass and the dark forest behind it through something that was warping the light around it. But the temperature at that location was warm, not hot, and heat shimmer requires much higher surface temperatures than 67 degrees to produce a visible distortion in ambient light conditions. Whatever was producing the shimmer was not doing so thermally. It was doing so optically. The light was bending around it as if it had a refractive boundary, a surface that redirected photons in the way that curved glass or water redirects photons. But the shimmer was not glass, and it was not water, and it was not a heat gradient. It was there, and it was bending the light, and it was not visible in any conventional sense. And it was breathing. I want to be precise about this because it's the most important detail. The shimmer had a rhythm. The refraction pattern at the leading edge, the boundary between the shimmer and the undistorted air, pulsed, not constantly, at intervals, long intervals, 8 to 12 seconds between cycles, the way very large animals breathe at rest, the way an elk or a horse breathes when it has been still for a while. The shimmer expanded slightly on the interval and contracted, the whole body of distortion moving in a pattern that corresponded to the expansion and compression of a chest cavity under deep respiration. I stood at the edge of the clearing and I watched it breathe. This went on for 4 hours. I'm going to describe the physiological state that produced 4 hours of standing still at the edge of a clearing in the dark, watching a shimmer that was breathing. My legs had no interest in moving, not paralysis, not fear response motor inhibition, but the specific stillness of military cover behavior, the trained suppression of unnecessary movement that becomes instinctive after 2 years of situations where unnecessary movement produces outcomes. The cover behavior engaged without my deciding to engage it. My breathing went slow and nasal, minimum audible output. My hands were at my sides, open, not gripping anything. My eyes were adapted to the low light, which at 7 in the evening in the Cascade forest under clear sky is functional. I could see the clearing. I could see the shimmer. I could see the beargrass at the shimmer's margins moving slightly on the breathing cycles. My stomach was hard and my jaw was set, and the back of my neck had a quality of sensitivity that I associate with exposed position, with the feeling of being in ground where you're visible to something you can't see. That feeling has a specific thermal component, a warmth, paradoxically, at the back of the neck, the skin registering blood flow increase to a vulnerable surface area. I felt that warmth for 4 hours. At 11 o'clock, the shimmer moved, not toward me. That's important, and I want to say it plainly. It moved to the right toward the south edge of the clearing, and the warm zone moved with it, and the beargrass bent in sequence as if something heavy was moving through it, each stem returning upright after the pressure passed, a trail of compressed grass marking a path that nothing visible was making. The shimmer reached the tree line, and the refraction changed quality, the background image behind it shifting from clearing light to forest dark. And then it was in the forest, and the shimmer was harder to track in the dark background, and then it was gone. I stood at the clearing edge for another 20 minutes. The temperature in the northeast quadrant dropped back to ambient. The wind resumed its normal southwest direction. At approximately 11:30, the first sound from the surrounding forest resumed. A great horned owl in the fir stand to the west, one call, and then silence again, and then after a few minutes, the small mammal sounds of the undergrowth, the normal percussion of a mountain forest at night. I walked back to the tower. I have hiked to that clearing 8 times since. I have found the temperature differential twice more. Both times in the early morning. Both times the warm anomaly in the northeast quadrant. Both times the shimmer present when I looked carefully at the zone. Both times I stood at the clearing edge and watched until it moved away. Both times I felt the neck warmth and the jaw tension and the 4-hour stillness that isn't paralysis, but is something my training produced and that this clearing consistently activates. I told my counselor it helped, actually. Not the thing in the clearing. The fact that the thing in the clearing produced a response that was not anxiety or hypervigilance or any of the clinical categories I'd been working through. It produced something older and cleaner and more proportionate. Something that knew exactly how large the thing in the clearing was and calibrated accordingly. The wilderness recalibrates. That's why I came. That's still why I come. I just didn't expect the recalibration to require a reference point that large. I know you can't hear this. I know that's not how it works. But you are the person I have been saving this story for. And the telling of it requires a person to tell it to. And I have been doing a lot of things alone since you died that I never expected to do alone. And this is one more of them. Thomas, this is for you. You proposed to me at this tower. You drove 3 hours from Portland on a Tuesday in October with a ring in your jacket pocket, and you climbed the tower stairs in the dark with a flashlight, and you knocked on the trap door, and you said, when I opened it, I know this is your place, but I was hoping it could also be ours. And it was ours for 16 years, and then it was mine. And I came back to work the following May because I needed to be somewhere that was ours, and also somewhere I knew how to function, and the tower is both of those things. I'm telling you what happened in September and October of last year, 5 years into the job, during what was supposed to be my last full season, before partial retirement. I'm telling you because it changed what I understand about this place, about this wilderness, and I want you to have the changed version. The version after September and October. I don't know what you would have said about it. I think you would have believed me. You always believed me, which is one of the things I'm still not finished being grateful for. The Three Sisters Wilderness. You know it. You hiked it with me that first summer, the long loop around South Sister. The way the volcanic landscape above timberline looks like the surface of somewhere else entirely, the black basalt and the pale pumice and the sky above it in late August, that blue, that specific blue that only exists above 8,000 feet in the Cascades, the blue that seems to come from inside the sky rather than being reflected from outside it. You took 40 photographs of that sky. I still have them. I monitor an elk herd in the meadow basin below the West Ridge as part of my district's wildlife survey obligations. Not formally, it's not in my position description, but for 3 years I have been recording contacts with the same herd, which I can identify individually across seasons. 11 animals in peak summer, dropping to 7 or 8 by late fall as the younger bulls move to lower elevation. I know this herd, I know their patterns, and I know the meadow they use, and I know what they look like when they're settled, and what they look like when something has moved through the basin that concerns them. On September 9th, I came down from the tower on my morning patrol and went to the meadow basin overlook, which I do every third day, and the meadow was empty. This happens. Elk move. But this herd has used this basin consistently for 3 years, and they don't relocate without a reason. And the reason is usually visible in the form of tracks or scat or kill evidence from a predator that has been working the area. I went down into the basin and surveyed it. No predator sign, no kill, no disturbance of the basin vegetation that would suggest a cougar in residence. The herd had left clean. They did not come back. In 12 weeks of monitoring, I had no elk contact in the basin. None. I documented this. I extended my surveys to the lower meadows and the ridge drainage above, and found occasional tracks in the lower elevation snow, which told me the herd was alive and had moved to winter range early. But they were gone from the basin 6 weeks earlier than any previous year, and the basin remained empty through the late summer and into the fall, which is usually the period of peak use. The basin felt different. I want to say that plainly before I describe the specific sensory details, because the specific sensory details are more convincing when you know that the cumulative impression preceded them. The basin felt different. The way a room feels different when something has changed in it that you haven't identified yet. The arrangement is wrong, the proportions are slightly off. Something that was there is absent, or something that wasn't there is present. I am a person who trusts that feeling, and I have been a person who trusts that feeling for long enough to know when it's telling me something real. The basin was telling me something real. The specific sensory details. The air in the basin from the 3rd week of September had a quality of pressure that I want to describe carefully. Not wind pressure. The basin is sheltered and the prevailing wind doesn't reach the floor of it. A static pressure. The kind you feel in your ears at the wrong altitude, except at 2 levels lower than the ridge. My ears would register it as I came down the approach trail to the overlook. A slight tension in the tympanic membrane, an almost imperceptible reduction in the acuity of my hearing, as if the atmospheric density at the basin floor had increased. I took my barometric pressure readings at the overlook and at the basin floor on 6 separate occasions and found no differential that would account for the sensation. The atmospheric pressure was normal. What I was feeling was not atmospheric. On the nights I camped near the tower, I have a site at the ridge margin that I use when the weather is good in late season. I would wake at 4 in the morning with the specific quality of wakefulness that full environmental alertness produces. All senses operational, sleep gone cleanly without transition. I would lie in the sleeping bag and feel the weight of the air on my chest. Not metaphorical weight, actual pressure against my sternum, mild but definite. The kind of pressure that a heavy blanket produces, except I was outside under a thin sleeping bag and the night air should have had no weight to it at all. This happened on 11 consecutive nights. I noted it every time. The dark above the west ridgeline on those nights. This is the part I have been trying to find language for since September, and I'm going to try one more time. The night sky above the 3 Sisters is extraordinary. You know this. We lay on the tower deck and looked at it on that October Tuesday, and you pointed out the Pleiades, and I pointed out that I had always called them the 7 Sisters, and you said there were actually only 6 visible to the naked eye. And I said, no, there were 7, and you said 6, and we looked it up the next morning on your phone, and I was right, and you said, of course you were right about the stars. You live up here. I still think about that conversation when I look at the Pleiades. I look for the 7th star. The dark above the west ridgeline was not the dark of the sky. The sky was clear on most of those 11 nights, and the stars were present at every elevation above the horizon, except the ridgeline. The ridgeline against the sky was dark in the way ridgelines are dark. The silhouette of the trees against the stellar background, the trees black, the sky pale with stars between them. And above the ridgeline, at irregular points along it, there was a density that was darker than the tree silhouettes. Not a gap in the stars. The stars were visible between the density and the ridgeline. The density was above the tree line, against the star field, and it absorbed the light behind it, the way a mass absorbs light. I watched it through my binoculars. The density had a margin. It was not diffuse. It had edges. On 6 of the 11 nights, the density moved along the ridgeline, slowly, without pattern, the way a large animal moves along a ridge at night when it is doing something other than running. I could track it by the stars it occluded. I watched it occlude and then restore the 7th Pleiad 4 times on the night of October 2nd. I made a sketch in my notebook each night. I have the sketches. On October 7th, the density came down from the ridge. I was at my camping site at the ridge margin. The time was just after midnight. I had been awake for 2 hours, the 4 in the morning wakefulness arriving early, lying under the weight of the air with my eyes open, and the sleeping bag tight around my legs, and the stars above me, and the density at the ridge moving in its slow, irregular way. It moved to the east end of the ridge. I tracked it by the stars. Then the tree silhouettes in the approach gully, the gully that comes off the ridge and runs through the basin before leveling into the meadow. The tree silhouettes in the gully went dark in sequence, top to bottom, something moving between me and the trees, occluding the dim sky reflection on their trunks as it passed. The shimmer appeared at the bottom of the gully, where the slope levels into the meadow grass. The distortion pattern in the meadow grass, the light from the stars bending around a surface with a different refractive index from the surrounding air, moving slowly. The beargrass stems tracking the pressure of its passage, bending and returning, 30 yards away. I want to describe accurately what my body did in the interval between seeing the shimmer and what came next. My pupils contracted first. Not dilated, contracted. The visual field brightening fractionally as the irises responded to something that my autonomic nervous system interpreted as a threat of sufficient magnitude to require enhanced acuity rather than enhanced light gathering. The distinction matters. Dilation improves sensitivity in low light. Contraction improves resolution. My body chose resolution. My body was trying to see clearly. My breathing slowed to approximately 6 breaths per minute. I know this because I was counting breaths to manage the response, which is a technique I learned in a grief counseling session and which I have used since in situations that required it. 6 breaths per minute is below resting rate and is the rate produced by deliberate slow breathing practice. My body arrived at it on its own. My hands were flat against my thighs through the sleeping bag fabric. Not gripping. Flat. My fingers were spread, and the pressure of my own hands against my thighs was a fixed point. I was using the way you use a fixed point in a spinning room. My stomach had hollowed. Not cramped, hollowed. The organs present, but the space between them suddenly apparent. A cavity below the diaphragm that I had not been aware of since the night the hospital called. My jaw was open. I noticed that. I had not opened it consciously. It was open, and I was breathing through it, and I could taste the night air of the Three Sisters Basin, the volcanic dust, and the frost on the beargrass, and the faint sweetness of the late-season sedge. And underneath all of that, reaching me across 30 yards of meadow, something organic and old and sweet in the specific way that old things are sweet. The way soil is sweet. The way the interior of a cave is sweet when the air has been cycling through limestone for 10,000 years. The shimmer was crossing the meadow toward the creek. I was between the shimmer and the creek. Not deliberately. I had not known the density was coming down from the ridge, and I had not positioned myself in its path. My campsite is at the ridge margin, and the path from the gully to the creek runs along the ridge margin, and I was there. The shimmer came within 12 feet of me. I want to give you the 12 feet in terms you can picture, Thomas, you were 6 feet tall, two of you, head to foot, between me and the shimmer. That's how close it came. And I was lying in a sleeping bag on the ground, and it was upright. The shimmer was vertical, and the dimension of the distortion field put it at somewhere between 8 and 9 feet in height, which means the shimmer was taller than you were, and I was horizontal, and there were 12 feet between us. I did not move. For 47 minutes, by my watch, I was watching the watch. I don't know why. Time was the only measurement I could take lying still. For 47 minutes, I did not move, and the shimmer was present in the meadow around my campsite. It did not remain at 12 feet. It moved. It moved around the perimeter of the site, slowly, the way an animal investigates a scent source by circling it. The beargrass tracking its movement, the stars bending and releasing, bending and releasing. At 8 feet, I heard breathing, a single exhalation, long, slow, the deep chest respiration of something very large at rest, the air moving out through a nasal passage much larger than mine, the sound of it at 8 feet in the still night air, clear and close and entirely real. The exhalation of a living thing that was 8 feet from my face, and that I could not see except as a distortion in the pattern of stars and beargrass behind it. I want to tell you what I thought. I thought, it knows I'm here. I was not hidden. I was in a sleeping bag in the open, and whatever was doing this systematic circuit of my campsite had been doing it for 20 minutes, and I was the obvious feature of the site, and it knew I was there. And it had continued the circuit anyway. And it was breathing at 8 feet with a slow regularity that said, I am not alarmed. I am not in a state of heightened arousal. I am here, and you are here, and I am breathing. After 47 minutes, the shimmer moved to the southwest, toward the lower meadow, and I watched the beargrass track its passage until the grass was too far to read in the starlight. And then I watched the stars for the density, and at the lower meadow margin I caught it once more against the sky. And then it was on the lower slope, and then it was gone into the dark of the valley. I lay in the sleeping bag until the sky began to lighten. I made no sound. I am not going to pretend I was calm. I was not calm. I was the specific opposite of calm that produces absolute stillness as a response rather than motion. The kind of not calm that burns itself out over 47 minutes and leaves behind a state that isn't calm either, but that functions like it. At first light, I got up, and I made my notes, and then I got out my dental stone kit, which I carry for cast evidence on wildlife surveys. And I went to the section of meadow where the shimmer had approached closest, and I looked for tracks. I found them in the moist volcanic soil at the creek margin, where the groundwater keeps the soil plastic and impressionable. 2 full impressions and 1 partial, in a line that ran from the meadow toward the creek crossing. Length, 18.5 inches. I measured this 4 times. Width, 9.3 inches. Toe count, 5, all 5 clearly impressed, the big toe showing the lateral displacement of a primate foot under load. Depth, 0.8 inches in soil that my own boot compressed by 0.2 inches under my full standing weight. The weight differential implied by that compression ratio, using the foot surface area as a base and standard soil resistance calculations, puts the load at somewhere between 800 and 1,000 pounds. I mixed the dental stone and I made the cast. It takes about 30 minutes to set in field conditions, and I sat beside it while it set, and I looked at the creek, and I listened to the water, and I tried to think about what I was going to do with what I now knew. I know what I know. I know it in the measurements and in the 47 minutes and in the 8 feet and the single slow exhalation in the dark. and the way the Pleiades looked when the seventh star came back after the density moved on. I have not told the district office the full account. I told them I found large unidentified track evidence and submitted the cast and the measurements. The cast is in the district evidence archive. The measurements are in the log. The 47 minutes are in this account and nowhere else. I came back this spring. I'm working my 6th season now. I have the view from the tower and the fire watch rotation and the elk basin to check every 3rd morning. And in September, the herd came back. All 11 of them on the morning of September 3rd, grazing the far end of the basin in the early light. I sat at the overlook and I counted them twice, and I wrote it in my log, and I felt something I have felt every time I've had good news since you died, which is the specific compound of the good thing itself and the awareness of who I would have told it to. I would have told you. I'm telling you now. This mountain, these sisters, this wilderness, it was here before the fire lookout program, and before the Forest Service, and before the survey parties, and before the trappers, and before every human presence that has left a name on a map. Whatever circled my campsite for 47 minutes on the night of October 7th has been in this basin for longer than the basin has been called a basin. It breathed at 8 feet, and it chose to keep moving. And I am here in my 6th season because of that choice, and I don't know what I did or didn't do to produce it, and I have stopped trying to figure that out. Some things that share a landscape with you do not require your understanding. They require your attention and your humility and your willingness to be less than the most significant thing present that I can do, that I've been practicing. You proposed to me here, I said yes, looking at the Pleiades through the tower glass, the 7 stars, and now I say yes again to whatever this wilderness is and has and holds and doesn't show. I say yes to the whole of it. That's what staying means. I love you, Thomas.